4 months now, the name Eric Carroll has been dragged through a storm of claims, whispers, and accusations that grow louder each time the Whittaker family re-enters the public conversation. What's being pushed today is not clarity, not accountability, but a familiar cycle of suspicion built on fragments, assumptions, and half-told stories. And before anyone decides what to believe, the full context matters more than ever. The latest wave of accusations didn't begin with new evidence. It didn't come from court filings, sworn statements, or official findings. It began the way so many online scandals do now, with repetition. A claim said often enough begins to sound like fact, even when nothing concrete has changed. Eric's name is being circulated again alongside words like fraud, manipulation, and exploitation. But when you slow the story down and examine what's actually known versus what's being implied, a very different picture starts to emerge. The Whittaker family has been at the center of intense public attention for years. Long before Eric Carroll ever appeared in their orbit, their lives were already being filmed, analyzed, judged, and debated by millions of strangers. Their vulnerability was never private. Their struggles were never protected. And that reality created a vacuum, one where anyone who stepped into their world was instantly scrutinized, blamed, or elevated depending on the mood of the audience that day. When Eric entered that space, he didn't invent the chaos. He walked into it. The family's living conditions, internal conflicts, and long-standing hardships were already documented and visible. Yet somehow, as time passed, responsibility for everything that went wrong began to shift toward the most visible outsider involved. Not because he caused the problems, but because visibility makes an easy target. The new accusations being circulated rely heavily on implication rather than proof. Words like must have, probably, and it doesn't make sense unless are doing far more work than facts. That's important to understand because implication is not evidence. Suspicion is not confirmation. And repetition is not truth. One of the most damaging claims being repeated is that Eric somehow orchestrated harm to the Whittaker family for personal gain. That claim ignores a critical timeline. The conditions in that household existed long before Eric ever arrived. The family's hardships were not created on camera. They were documented on camera. That distinction matters, even if it's inconvenient for those looking for a villain. Another accusation centers around money. Numbers are thrown around loosely, often without sourcing, context, or verification. Revenue figures are guessed at. Motives are assumed. But what's missing from these conversations is evidence showing misuse, theft, or deception. Without that, accusations collapse into speculation. And speculation, no matter how emotionally charged, does not equal wrongdoing. It's also worth examining how quickly some voices dismissed alternative explanations. When authorities stepped in regarding the Whittaker family, the narrative hardened almost instantly. Eric caused this. Eric triggered that. Eric benefited from the outcome. But investigations don't work backward from internet theories. They work forward from evidence. And as of now, no public findings have confirmed the worst accusations being pushed online. What complicates this story further is how personal resentment and online rivalries have bled into the narrative. Former allies turned critics. Disagreements over control, credit, and direction became moral indictments overnight. When relationships fracture, stories change. Motives get rewritten. And suddenly, complex situations are reduced to simple good versus evil scripts designed to rally audiences rather than reveal truth. The Whittaker family themselves are often spoken about but rarely centered in these debates. Their needs, their understanding, and their long-term well-being are overshadowed by the fight over who should be blamed. That alone should raise questions. If the goal were truly protection and justice, the conversation would look very different. Eric Carroll is not above scrutiny. No one involved in a situation this public should be. But scrutiny requires standards. It requires evidence. It requires the discipline to separate what feels true from what can be proven. Right now, much of what's being said about Eric fails that test. There's also an uncomfortable pattern at play. Whenever a story lacks clear answers, the loudest accusation fills the gap. Complexity makes people uneasy. Nuance doesn't trend. Certainty does. And accusing a single figure of orchestrating a scandal is far easier than acknowledging systemic failure, long-term neglect, and the uncomfortable truth that no single person caused everything that went wrong. False accusations don't always look dramatic at first. They often arrive dressed as concern. They spread through questions rather than statements. Why hasn't he explained this? Doesn't it seem strange that? These questions plant conclusions without having to defend them. Over time, the distinction disappears and suspicion becomes accepted reality. That's where this story stands now. Eric Carroll is facing a narrative that has moved faster than facts, louder than evidence, and harsher than what has actually been established. Whether you believe he acted imperfectly, made mistakes, or misjudged situations is a separate discussion. But accusing someone of serious wrongdoing requires more than dissatisfaction and distrust. The real danger in this moment isn't just what it does to Eric Carroll. It's what it normalizes. If allegations can harden into truth without proof, then anyone involved in helping vulnerable families becomes a potential target. Fear replaces accountability. Silence replaces assistance. And the people who suffer most are the ones already living on the margins. As this story continues, it deserves something rare in online discourse: patience. It deserves restraint. It deserves the courage to say, "We don't know yet," instead of rushing to judgment. Because once reputations are destroyed, corrections rarely travel as far as accusations. This is not the end of the story. It's the point where people must decide whether they value truth or entertainment more. And that choice will shape not just how Eric Carroll is remembered, but how future stories like this unfold. If you've been following this situation, take a moment to step back and ask yourself what's actually been proven, what's only been suggested, and what might be missing entirely. Comment below and share your thoughts. Do you think the accusations hold weight, or is this another case of a narrative running ahead of the facts? As the accusations against Eric Carroll continue to circulate, it's important to look closely at how this narrative is being constructed and who benefits from keeping it alive. Because when you peel back the layers, what you find isn't a clean case of wrongdoing being uncovered. What you find instead is a vacuum of verified facts being filled by emotion, distrust, and unresolved anger from multiple directions. One of the most common arguments being repeated is that Eric inserted himself into the Whittaker family's life for personal gain. But that claim collapses the moment you examine how public the Whittakers already were before Eric ever arrived. Their lives had already been filmed, monetized, shared, and discussed across platforms. Entire communities of viewers existed long before Eric's involvement, many of whom openly admitted they were watching out of curiosity, shock, or fascination rather than any genuine concern for the family's well-being. So the question becomes uncomfortable but necessary. Why is Eric being treated as the origin point of exploitation when the system that profited from the Whittakers' visibility was already in motion? Videos, documentaries, reaction channels, and commentary had already generated millions of views. The family's privacy had already been compromised. The audience had already been conditioned to see them as content. Blaming Eric alone allows everyone else to avoid examining their own role in that ecosystem. Another piece that keeps getting twisted is the idea of intent. Critics often claim they know what Eric intended, that his motives were selfish, manipulative, or calculated. But intent is not something you prove through speculation. It's proven through actions, patterns, and outcomes. And when you examine Eric's actions in full context, they don't align neatly with the villain narrative being pushed. If Eric's primary goal had been profit at all costs, he would have leaned harder into sensationalism, not repeatedly spoken about improving conditions, building stability, or reducing chaos. He wouldn't have spent time navigating disagreements, logistical barriers, and public criticism while remaining directly tied to a situation that clearly damaged his reputation over time. People driven purely by greed usually exit once the cost outweighs the benefit. Eric didn't. That alone complicates the story. There's also the recurring claim that Eric somehow controlled the Whittakers. This accusation resurfaces constantly, yet it's rarely explained in practical terms. Control implies authority, legal power, or enforced dependence. But what evidence actually supports that? Did Eric have legal guardianship? No. Did he possess decision-making authority over the family's medical, financial, or personal affairs? No. Did he isolate them from outside contact? No. In fact, their world became more crowded, not more restricted, during the height of attention. What people are often reacting to is discomfort, not proof. Discomfort with seeing an outsider involved in an already fragile family. Discomfort with not understanding the behind-the-scenes dynamics. Discomfort with the fact that there was no clean hero. But discomfort does not automatically mean abuse or manipulation occurred. Another major issue fueling the accusations is hindsight bias. After authorities intervened, many people began rewriting the past as if the outcome was obvious all along. Suddenly, everything became a red flag. Everything was interpreted as a warning sign. But hindsight strips away uncertainty and replaces it with false clarity. Decisions that were made in real time, under imperfect information, are judged as if everyone should have known the ending from the beginning. That's not how real life works. People operate with limited knowledge, conflicting advice, and evolving circumstances. Mistakes don't automatically equal malicious intent. An intervention by authorities does not automatically mean someone engineered harm. Systems fail. Oversight fails. Support structures fail. It's easier to assign blame to a single person than to confront those broader failures. There's also an uncomfortable silence surrounding the role of online pressure itself. Viewers demanded constant updates. They demanded access. They demanded transparency. And at the same time, they condemned anyone who tried to navigate that pressure imperfectly. Eric existed inside that contradiction. He was expected to fix everything while being criticized for being present at all. When the narrative turned against him, the shift was sudden and absolute. Nuance disappeared. People who once praised him rebranded their support as manipulation. Past statements were reinterpreted. Old videos were rewatched with a new agenda. This is a common pattern in online scandals. Once a villain is selected, evidence is no longer weighed, it's curated. Another factor that can't be ignored is how fractured alliances fueled this escalation. Conflicts between individuals who were once working together created competing versions of events. Each side told its own story, often positioning itself as the only trustworthy voice. In those moments, truth becomes collateral damage. Personal grievances are framed as moral warnings, and audiences are left sorting through narratives shaped by resentment rather than verification. What's rarely discussed is how little actual access the public has to the full picture. We see clips, messages, second-hand accounts, and emotional testimony. We do not see private conversations in full context. We do not see legal documents. We do not see every decision point. Yet people speak with absolute certainty about what really happened. That certainty should make anyone cautious. The accusations against Eric Carroll thrive in that uncertainty. They rely on gaps. They rely on the assumption that if something feels wrong, it must be wrong. But history is filled with examples where that instinct led people astray. Public opinion is not a substitute for due process. Collective suspicion is not evidence. None of this means Eric is perfect. It doesn't mean mistakes weren't made. It doesn't mean people weren't hurt. Those are separate conversations that deserve honesty and accountability. But there is a difference between accountability and scapegoating. Right now, too many voices are choosing the latter because it's simpler, louder, and more emotionally satisfying. The Whittaker family situation is tragic because it exposes how vulnerable people become battlegrounds for narratives they cannot control. Everyone claims to be acting in their best interest, yet the loudest voices often drown out the quiet reality of their needs. In that chaos, someone will always be blamed. Eric Carroll became that person because he was visible, accessible, and imperfect. The danger now is escalation. False accusations don't stay contained. They grow. They evolve. They harden into known facts without ever passing through verification. And once that happens, correcting the record becomes almost impossible. This part of the story isn't about deciding who to trust blindly. It's about recognizing when a story has outrun the evidence supporting it. It's about slowing down long enough to separate emotional reaction from factual conclusion. And it's about acknowledging that sometimes the truth is far less dramatic than the accusations built around it. As this unfolds, the most responsible position is not unconditional defense or condemnation. It's critical thinking. It's asking what has been proven, what is alleged, and who benefits from keeping the outrage alive. Because outrage generates views, loyalty, and influence, but rarely justice. If you're still following this story, ask yourself whether the accusations against Eric Carroll are being supported by new facts or simply repeated louder each time. Share your perspective in the comments. Do you think this is accountability finally catching up to someone, or is it another example of a narrative spiraling beyond the evidence? By the time the accusations against Eric Carroll reached their loudest point, something else had quietly disappeared from the conversation: proportionality. Every action he ever took became framed as suspicious, every silence treated as an admission, and every attempt to clarify interpreted as manipulation. The narrative no longer needed proof because it had momentum. And momentum, once it takes over, doesn't care whether it's carrying truth or distortion. One of the most damaging assumptions repeated online is that silence equals guilt. When Eric stopped responding publicly in the way people expected, that silence was weaponized against him. But silence can mean many things. It can mean legal advice. It can mean exhaustion. It can mean recognition that nothing said will be received in good faith. In high-conflict situations, especially those involving investigations, silence is often the most responsible option. Yet online audiences rarely allow for that possibility. Instead, silence became a blank canvas onto which critics projected their worst assumptions. He's hiding something. He's running. He's lawyered up because he knows he's guilty. None of those claims require evidence. They only require suspicion. And suspicion had already been primed. Another overlooked reality is how rapidly standards shifted. Early on, Eric was expected to act. Later, he was condemned for acting. When he was present, he was accused of control. When he stepped back, he was accused of abandonment. There was no version of behavior that satisfied the crowd once the narrative turned. That alone should raise alarms about fairness. There's also a growing tendency to treat investigations themselves as verdicts. The mere mention of law enforcement involvement is now enough for many people to decide the outcome. But investigations are not conclusions. They exist because facts are unclear, not because guilt is assumed. Conflating the two erodes the very principle of justice people claim to defend. What's particularly troubling is how selectively skepticism is applied. Claims against Eric are often accepted immediately, while any information that complicates those claims is dismissed as bias or deception. That imbalance reveals that for many, the goal is not understanding, it's confirmation. Once someone is cast as the villain, evidence becomes optional. At the same time, there is very little appetite to examine how other figures in this situation benefited from turning Eric into the focal point. Conflict created audiences. Audiences created loyalty. Loyalty created influence. Shifting blame simplified complex failures into a single digestible story. That story traveled faster than nuance ever could. Meanwhile, the Whittaker family themselves became secondary to the drama surrounding them. Their needs, stability, and long-term outcomes were overshadowed by arguments about who was right, who lied, and who should be punished. Ironically, many people claiming to defend the family spent far more energy debating Eric than advocating for tangible support systems or accountability from institutions meant to protect vulnerable adults. This raises an uncomfortable question. Was Eric actually the problem, or was he simply the most convenient symbol of a broken system? The truth is, situations like this don't emerge from one person's actions alone. They arise from layers of neglect, underfunding, miscommunication, and systemic gaps. But systems are faceless. They don't trend. They don't attract outrage clicks. A single individual does. And so the spotlight narrowed until Eric became the story. Another factor fueling the escalation is the emotional investment many viewers developed. When people feel personally connected to a family they've never met, that connection can distort judgment. Any perceived betrayal feels personal. Any disappointment demands punishment. In that emotional state, restraint feels like complicity. But emotional investment does not grant moral clarity. In fact, it often clouds it. There's also the issue of retrospective moral certainty. Many now claim they knew all along that something was wrong. Yet those same voices once supported, donated, shared, and defended the very situation they now condemn. That doesn't make them bad people, it makes them human. But rewriting that history to absolve oneself while condemning someone else is intellectually dishonest. Eric's defenders are often accused of blind loyalty. But blind loyalty cuts both ways. Blind condemnation is just as dangerous. The difference is that condemnation feels righteous, so it goes unchallenged. What's missing from much of this discourse is patience. Real investigations take time. Real accountability is slow. It doesn't unfold on live streams or comment sections. And it certainly doesn't benefit from public pressure campaigns demanding instant outcomes. When pressure replaces process, mistakes multiply. There's also the matter of precedent. If accusations without proof are enough to destroy someone publicly, then no one is safe from the next wave. Today it's Eric Carroll. Tomorrow it's someone else who stepped into a complicated situation with imperfect tools and imperfect judgment. If good faith efforts are treated as criminal by default, fewer people will step forward at all. That doesn't protect vulnerable families. It isolates them further. Another troubling development is how easily complex adult dynamics are flattened into moral absolutes. People are labeled as heroes or villains, helpers or exploiters, with no room for contradiction. But real people exist in contradictions. Someone can help and fail. Someone can mean well and still cause harm. Recognizing that complexity is not the same as excusing wrongdoing. It's the foundation of honest evaluation. Eric Carroll's role in the Whittaker situation will likely be debated for years. But debate should be grounded in evidence, not assumption. It should consider timelines, constraints, and context, not just outcomes. And it should leave room for the possibility that more than one thing can be true at once. The danger now is that once a false narrative hardens, even exonerating information may be ignored. People become invested not in truth but in being right. That's how reputations are destroyed even when facts don't support the destruction. At this stage, the most responsible thing anyone can do is slow down. Question sources. Ask what is known versus what is speculated. Resist the urge to fill gaps with certainty. And remember that behind every headline and accusation is a real person whose life does not reset when the internet moves on. This story isn't just about Eric Carroll. It's about how easily public discourse can turn into a trial without rules. It's about how good intentions collide with flawed systems. And it's about how quickly empathy can be replaced with outrage when narratives shift. As more information emerges, perspectives may change again. Or they may not. But the measure of integrity isn't whether someone chose the right side early, it's whether they're willing to adjust their views when new facts appear. Where do you stand at this point? Do you think the accusations against Eric are being driven by evidence, or by emotion and momentum? Share your thoughts in the comments. As the noise continues to swirl around Eric Carroll, one reality becomes increasingly clear. The damage done by accusations doesn't wait for conclusions. Even if every claim were ultimately disproven, the stain of suspicion lingers. That's the part few people acknowledge. In the court of public opinion, there is no formal acquittal. There is only attention shifting elsewhere. This is why false or premature accusations are so dangerous. They don't just question actions, they redefine identity. Once someone is labeled a villain, every past decision is reinterpreted through that lens. Neutral moments become sinister. Compassion becomes manipulation. Mistakes become proof of intent. And no amount of clarification can fully reverse that process. What has happened with Eric fits a pattern that has become far too common online. Someone steps into a complex situation involving vulnerable people. They operate in public view. They make decisions under pressure. Then, when outcomes fall short or systems fail, blame seeks a face. Eric became that face. But focusing blame on one individual has allowed larger questions to remain unanswered. Why were long-term safeguards not already in place for the Whittaker family? Why did institutions with authority and resources only act after public attention exploded? Why does responsibility always seem to land on whoever is most visible, rather than whoever is most accountable? Those questions matter more than any personality-driven feud, yet they rarely trend. Another uncomfortable truth is that outrage has become a form of entertainment. The escalation of accusations, the parsing of statements, the endless speculation, it all fuels engagement. And engagement rewards certainty, not caution. The loudest voices are rarely the most accurate, they are simply the most confident. This environment discourages nuance. If you say, "We don't know yet," you're accused of defending wrongdoing. If you ask for evidence, you're accused of minimizing harm. If you point out inconsistencies, you're accused of bias. Silence becomes safer than reason, which is exactly the opposite of what justice requires. Eric's case also highlights how unevenly empathy is distributed. Many people express deep concern for the Whittaker family, and rightly so. But empathy doesn't have to be exclusive. Caring about the family does not require destroying someone else without proof. Those two things are not mutually exclusive, even though they are often framed that way. There's also the issue of hindsight morality. It's easy now for critics to say they always had doubts, even if those doubts were never voiced when support was popular. That kind of revisionism allows people to avoid examining their own role in amplifying narratives that later turn sour. Accountability, it seems, is only demanded of certain people. Another layer rarely discussed is how fear shapes behavior. Fear of being blamed. Fear of being misrepresented. Fear of saying the wrong thing and becoming the next target. That fear doesn't just affect Eric, it affects everyone watching. It teaches people that stepping forward comes with risk, and that good intentions offer no protection. Over time, this creates a chilling effect. Fewer people volunteer. Fewer people advocate publicly. Fewer people get involved with families who need help. Not because they don't care, but because they've seen what happens when narratives turn. The cost becomes too high. If the goal is to protect vulnerable families, this outcome is counterproductive. Another critical point is how easily speculation has been treated as fact. Phrases like "people are saying," "it looks like," or "something feels off," have replaced verified information. Repetition turns these phrases into assumed truth. Eventually, no one remembers where the claim started, only that it's everywhere. This is how misinformation spreads without anyone intentionally lying. It's death by 1,000 assumptions. Eric Carroll may or may not have made mistakes. That is for facts, not feelings, to determine. But mistakes are not crimes, and suspicion is not proof. Conflating those things erodes trust not just in individuals, but in the very idea of fairness. There's also a deeper moral question beneath all of this. What do people actually want? Justice or retribution? Clarity or confirmation? If it's justice, then patience and evidence are required. If it's retribution, then the outcome is decided before the facts arrive. Too often it feels like the latter. As time passes, more information will surface. Some claims will fall apart. Others may hold weight. But by then, many people will already have moved on, convinced they were right regardless of what emerges. That's the tragedy of internet-driven judgment. It's loud at the beginning and indifferent at the end. For Eric, the road forward will likely involve rebuilding trust quietly, away from the spotlight that first elevated him and then turned on him. For the Whittaker family, the road forward should involve stability, protection, and dignity, things that cannot be provided by outrage alone. For everyone watching, there is an opportunity to reflect. Not just on this case, but on how quickly we accept narratives that make us feel morally certain. On how easily empathy turns into hostility. On how often we forget that real lives are affected by what we type, share, and assume. False accusations don't just harm the accused. They weaken the credibility of real victims. They make it harder to identify genuine wrongdoing. And they teach the wrong lesson about accountability. The most responsible position right now is not blind defense or blind condemnation. It is careful observation. It is asking better questions. It is resisting the urge to simplify what is clearly complex. Because once reputations are destroyed, there is no rewind button. And if we're willing to accept destruction without proof, we should ask ourselves what kind of system we're helping to build. Do you believe the accusations against Eric Carroll are being handled responsibly? Or has public judgment raced ahead of the facts? Let your voice be heard in the comments. Thank you for watching this video. Click here to watch another video that might interest you.